tell the audience about how you got started in real estate. All right, Michael, welcome to the show. Super excited to have you. I'm a real estate guy, not a full business guy, so I'm excited to talk to you about all sorts of credit things. So thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
So imagine you didn't go to your career day saying, I want to be, the chief credit officer someday. So how'd you get started in your career?
Well, it's a bit of a long story. I'll try and make it short. When I graduated from college, which was the University of Utah,
Go Utes.
go Utes, I went to work for my father, who was a developer. And like you said, it tends to be in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And he had developed some very notable projects in Park City. The Stein Erikson Lodge would be one.
That is so cool. I had no idea. That's awesome.
Yeah. He was one of four. Stein was one of four. And there were two other, I guess, more passive investors. But they bought the property. It was one of the first land transactions in Deer Valley, and built it as a condominium. At the time, it was a 32-plex and the common area. And sales went really well. My father ended up leaving that entity and developing some other property in Park City. Before that, he had developed the Holiday Inn and the shopping center behind it. I don't know if you know that property, but it's when you drive in.
Yeah.
And he'd had success there. And I had learned from him some basic real estate principles, but he was a wild man. He would guarantee loans, and he had a very I would say not a real structured. Oh, sorry about that. That's my mom. My mom's still alive. But he was a real earthy guy. He didn't really have structure around him, and didn't organize around real business principles. And back in those days, you didn't have spreadsheets. Lotus 1, 2, 3, which turned into Word, or turned into what is it now?
I'm not sure.
Excel.
Oh, Excel. Yeah.
That had just come on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to play with that. I started to play with some other software products that were brand new. This would be in 83 to 85, somewhere in there. And I brought structure to what he was doing and presented it to investors, the bank that we had. And he wasn't really, he didn't really care about that. But I knew it was going to be important. And it gave me a way to look at X's and O's and look at structure. And, whether it was price per foot or the sale price of a unit versus the release price of a unit and the profit minus commissions, all that. He didn't really think that way. He was, but he was really smart.
So is he just kind of on a back of an envelope saying, I think I can build it for this and I can sell for this and I'll probably make money? Is that?
Yeah. exactly.
I love those guys.
There are a few left, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was the big project that I was involved in, and I actually ended up working for the two architects that were the designers of it. One, his name was Ted War. He was the original designer of the Stein Erikson Lodge, and then Boyd Blackner came in and filled in some blanks at the end. And then they did a phase 2. My dad wasn't part of that. He had gone on to develop some other properties. He developed the Pine Inn, which is at the base of Deer Valley, and was a 10-unit log condo. Very rare.
Yeah.
And the logs were hand-pilled. They weren't machine-pilled. And I was very intrigued by that. I ended up working for the log operator that put those together in Missoula, Montana. But that was an interesting project, and that came on the market when things had softened. So my dad struggled through that project and property. And he had built a very nice house in Park City, and we grew up here. We grew up on Yale Avenue, and we kept that house. And I went to college while going and living in that house, and sort of worked for him then as well. But anyway, it kind of all came to an end. But he still had projects on his mind. He still had his real estate license, and my mom got her real estate license, and they became kind of a duo. And that's really where things ended up, was selling houses. My mom and dad were salespeople.
Nice.
And but through all that, I saw his struggles, and I saw what he wasn't good at, and I decided that I would take my family, my 2 kids, and my wife, and move to California and enter a master's program at Pepperdine.
And was the idea still real estate banking some idea, or was it just like, I want to go to business school and figure it out then?
The latter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you move out there. I'm assuming you don't know very many people, do you?
Didn't know many people at all.
So you go to Pepperdine, you enjoy it, and then you start working in LA, right?
Started working in LA, worked there for about 15 years. Worked for 2 savings and loans.
Mm-hmm.
Great Western Savings was the first one, and the CEO was a friend of our family, and was nice enough to give me a position, but it was not a position in true finance. It was almost HR related. And I did that for probably a year or 2 while I was getting my master's, and decided I wanted to try something different. And I met the CEO of Glendale Federal at around that same time period, and he offered me a position at dinner. I flew up to Park City and had dinner with my family, and he and some other execs. And he offered me a job on the spot. He asked me to come see him the following Monday. I did, and he hired me, and that was a really interesting job. He initially told me that I would be a management intern, a paid management intern. And I lived in the San Fernando Valley, but it was a bit of a hike to get to Glendale, because that's where their corporate offices were. Had some good leaders that ran the intern program. But that was really a branch manager training program, and I didn't want to be a branch manager. I wanted to be in the finance world. And I met the head of the real estate finance group there. His name was Dick Riebel. He was a great guy. He gave me a job. He told me to go down to Newport Beach, where they had an office. And
you said, twist my arm. I guess I'll head to Newport.
So I headed to Newport, and we moved. By then I had a child who'd passed away, and we were, starting the core of our family. And so we bought a house in Mission Viejo, and I commuted, and that's where I really started to learn the finance business. And I had some friends that I'd made that were business people and bankers, and they sent me some deals, and I started to underwrite them. I had learned to underwrite at Glendale Federal.
What time frame was this, by the way?
This would be 85 to 86, somewhere in there.
Okay, so yeah. pre SNL, which we'll talk about, but right, SNL was it 91?
Well, things started to unwind in the SNL world probably 89.
Okay.
And then came to a conclusion 91, 92.
Okay, so you learned how to underwrite with these guys.
Yeah, and they were project finance people. They looked at the project. They didn't look at sponsors or guarantors or...
The good old days?
The good old days. And some bankers and some banks and some credit companies still look at the transaction and look at the fundamentals of the underlying asset. And those are mostly non-recourse loans, and they're designated that way, meaning non-recourse to the sponsor, the developer. So that's how I really learned. And after I'd done that for a few years, I had a friend that I made. He was in banking. He worked for First Interstate Bank. And he had an office in Newport, and I wanted to be in Newport. And so I went to work for that bank and learned how to underwrite financial statements and sponsors in that space.
What were you looking at the time? Was it track record? Was it their assumptions? Like, when you say underwriting, what exactly are you looking at?
Well, to underwrite a sponsor, I mean, it's, all financial statement driven, and it's, like you said, the history of their borrowings. You're always looking to answer the question, have they defaulted on a recourse loan? That's really an important thing to know. And some had, some hadn't, and the ones that hadn't were strong, and they had big, enterprises and empires out there in California. The First Interstate, we banked a lot of folks that came from the Jewish side. Nathan Chappelle was one. Jonah Goldrich was one. These were folks that had left either Germany or Austria or one of the countries that was part of World War II, and but they were Jewish and they'd been ousted, but they had developed wealth. Nathan Chappelle was one that, he had probably a $300 million net worth, and it was all treasuries in the mid-'80s.
Really?
Yeah. One of the wealthier folks back then in probably America. And, they had their own history. And I learned a lot from them, both good and bad. But for the most part, they were very honorable. And I appreciated that about the Jewish community. I made a lot of friends in that set. I learned how to bank beyond projects. I'd bank in, a company, multiple credit facilities to one company. And developed a pretty good reputation as a banker. I started out as at First Interstate, it was what they called a team leader. And a team leader had 3 to 4 to 5 bankers that worked for them, and they reported to a manager. I reported to a manager. The manager I reported to had all of Orange County. And then I worked for another manager that had all of San Diego, and we moved around in those markets, which was great experience because, back then we had a Thomas guide. Do you know what a Thomas guide is?
No idea.
Well, today you just pull out your wallet and
Yeah.
you figure out where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
Back then you had a thing called a Thomas guide, and it was a little map, but it was multiple pages, and you'd have to go through a taxonomy to find what you needed to find. But I could find any address in Southern California on a page, and I'd get to that page, and then I'd figure out how to drive down the streets to get to a place. But we didn't have these.
Yeah.
And that's how we'd see the real estate that we would finance, which was a different way to kind of appreciate real estate. I think today's just as well. I think you can see multiple views, and you can see renderings if it's a to be built, and we always had those. But yeah, that's how I learned. That's where I learned. I really learned how to finance real estate in California.
So I want to talk about S&L for a little bit. I don't know this, was all the savings and loans, actual loans, construction loans, they were all recourse. Is that correct?
No,
Or they were
no,
non-recourse?
no.
Oh,
Mostly non.
oh, that's
Banks were recourse. S&Ls weren't.
okay. So let's talk about S&L for a little bit. Kind of, I guess, not too deep of a history lesson, but kind of why it happened and how you navigated through that, being on the banking and the savings and loan side.
Well, I made the move from S&Ls to banking before the S&L crisis really materialized. And I watched it, but I was on the banking side and felt like I was going to be fine, because S&L started to be closed, and there was a whole movement. The RTC, the Resolution Trust Company, was like a federal agency, and they were tasked with really finding the best S&Ls and then closing other S&Ls. And there were S&Ls that were closed while I was still making loans at a bank. And there were a lot of deals were made in the 80s where S&Ls were given a period of time to mend a balance sheet that they may have taken on that was a little toxic, but they didn't have to pay a big penalty for that. And the RTC and the feds kind of came in and took that away. And that's when a lot of S&Ls started to fail.
Feels like a lot of the really great companies that we know today, like Starwood Capital, Sam Zales Company, they were kind of birthed out of the S&L. You've got Wasatch Properties out here. They kind of took off from the S&L crisis. I've always been curious, how were those people not affected? Or maybe they were, just not as bad as other groups.
Well, I think a big part of it was, non-recourse loans, which the S&Ls mostly provided, were on the asset itself, and a lot of assets were given back in that crisis. I'll call it the 89 to 94 time period. And those savings and loans, a lot of them failed. And, non-recourse loan, when you have 100 non-recourse loans, you're going to do as well as the market does, but you're not going to do as well as your sponsors have done. You are if they voluntarily fund an asset that has, say, a negative cash flow.
Did you see that happening?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was quite an experience. And I mean, I saw it in banking too. Even sponsors that were underwritten. I don't know if they were well underwritten, but they were underwritten.
They were. in some capacity.
And some of them had a lot of capital and liquidity and used it to solve problems and pay down exposure. But a lot of them couldn't make it. And so about 1992 or 3 is when we started to see a little life back in the real estate industry, not just in California, but in the West and nationally. And, everybody had to have a plan and a strategy for how they were going to bank the industry because it was coming back. And banks had the pole position. S&Ls were mostly shut down. And a lot of the S&L execs were okay. They didn't do as well maybe as they would have done had they converted to a bank or been converted to a bank. But I was in banking, and our bank, First Interstate Bank, was not as well capitalized as other banks, and in 95, I decided to move back here to Utah. And in 96, Wells Fargo bought First Interstate. So the year after I left. So I kind of missed out on that. I had a lot of friends that got big packages, and but I came here to start, a new life, and my parents still lived here. They were alive. My brothers and sister were here, and so we moved to Alpine, Utah, and that was a great experience, great place to live. Unfortunately, I had to commute for a good 20 years from Alpine to Salt Lake because Salt Lake is where I got the job.
And where was the new job at?
Well, the new job was at Bank One.
Okay.
And one of the leaders that we had at Bank One had left the bank that I was associated with, First Interstate, and he had created an operation at Bank One. Well, he actually was promoted and became the national real estate guy for Bank One. And he was controversial and, had some interesting personal habits that got him in trouble. So he had left, and then he hired me to come to Utah and really take what wasn't a very well-run group here, Bank One Group, $140 million in assets, loans, some okay borrowers, sponsors, and asked me to grow that book of business. And then he gave me the Northwest as a region, and I hired a fellow to run that. He was in Portland. And so now we're really talking about the latter 90s, and so I built that. I built that book into about a $2 billion book.
And how do you grow that book? Are you just talking to developers saying, hey, give us a chance on your next loan? I mean, you got to have deposits to fund this as well, right? So you're trying to make more relationships with businesses. Like, how does that work?
Well, the deposit side is interesting. It's more interesting now than it has been for a long time. When you're paying a 50 basis point deposit rate, you can charge cheaply for loans. But, when you're at 5% on your deposit rate, you need to get something. They talk a lot about an index, the difference between your yield and your cost of funds. That's central to any banking operation. And so when you have a loss, that's going to eat into your margin. But, 300 margin is what you see a lot today, maybe even a little higher, 300 basis points. But, um, you see, um, a lot of the way you grow a book of business is really through the sponsors that you bank, and sometimes the information that you read. I was a big reader of. I read annual reports. I knew who the banks were. I knew who they were banking. I knew where we could come in and bid a transaction and take it away from another bank. Um, and you have to be aggressive when you're growing a book of business. It's not easy. It has risk. You're taking on new sponsors that you've never met. But you tell them, you like their next project and you want to take a run at it. And then you put a term sheet together and you hope it wins.
Okay, so you're growing this book of business. Then, did that bank get bought by J.P. Morgan? Is that what happens next?
Yeah.
And is Jamie Dimon as cool as he feels online?
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
So I want to take a little bit of a sidebar on, the difference between, and we'll get to this in a second, but kind of Zions or regional banks versus the JP Morgans, the kind of too big to fail banks. What kind of is the difference between those as just a company overall? Like what's the biggest difference between JP Morgan, Chase Bank, and Zions?
Well, JP Morgan Chase, well, first of all, it's really two banks. So Chase is the commercial bank. JP Morgan's the investment bank. And Jamie, he came from that world. He worked for Citigroup, and I guess I could say this because he's written about it in his books, but he was let go at a Christmas party.
Brutal.
And he had run their investment bank. He had run their commercial bank, and he was a fixer. He'd go in and fix things that were broken. But there's some great stories about him. He didn't drive a car until he was like 35, because he would take either a train and ultimately a private car, into work in Manhattan, and didn't really, he started a family. I think 2 daughters, but he never had a driver's license. He was like 35. But then he got serious and became a player, and was the number 1 guy behind Sandy Weil. Sandy Weil was the CEO of Citi. And apparently he and Jamie had some kind of row. I think it was a Christmas party, and Sandy fired him on the spot that day.
It's crazy.
That night. And so Jamie left. He took a big package, and he traveled for a year. Took his 2 daughters and his wife. They went on the road. And that would have been about 90. No, that would have been maybe 89, somewhere in there. And they traveled all over the place. And he had a big wallet. And I'll never forget the starting day, his first day. They invited senior managers to come to Chicago. And so I went, other of my peers went, and it was in the, I can't remember the name of the building, but the building had a downstairs auditorium. And this was to meet Jamie. this meeting. So we were all there sitting in this auditorium, and I think they said there were 150 to 200 of us. And he came out and said, I'm Jamie, and I'm your new CEO, and excited to be here. And he said, I've got 3 principles I want you to all understand. This is what I'm about. And I'll never forget it. He said, the first principle is, I don't hire or promote based on gender. I hire the best person. And they say he'd been fired at Citi for not hiring Sandy's daughter or promoting her. She was, I think, running the investment bank. So that was number 1. He said, it's all about the individual. And then he said, we're going to grow this bank. And if we have to cut the dividend to do it, we will. And they did. And he said, he said, I might get angry. I might not be what you want me to be in meetings. But I will say, what's on my mind. And he had a couple of other principles, but that was who he was. And he solidified his standing with his senior managers pretty quick. And we knew he had a good leader, and he moved to Chicago. And didn't move back to New York until he took the J.P. Morgan position.
And so Jamie Dimon buys the bank, or J.P. Morgan Chase buys the bank. What does that look like when J.P. Morgan buys a bank, and then kind of how did your role transition? You led the mezzanine fund, right?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. So the merger was not a merger of equals. They may have said it was, but J.P. Morgan was not as well capitalized as their name would suggest. And Bank One, because of all the things Jamie did, was well capitalized. And I think Jamie knew that. I think he levered that to, get his place at J.P. Morgan. So I'm not, when I look at J.P. Morgan Chase, they had a very small real estate book. Chase had a very small real estate book. And they had bankers that, I think our book was about $16 billion at the time. And I think theirs was $600 million. So they had really downplayed commercial real estate. And, Jamie was not a fan of commercial real estate. He'd blown out can't remember the name of the company he sold or liquidated before he came to Bank One. I think it was a big life company that Citi had acquired, MetLife, one of those big ones. And so he had unwound that. And so he wasn't a real fan of commercial real estate. But I don't think he totally understood it. And over the years, through acquisitions and picking up this bank or that portfolio, or he's ended up with quite a bit of commercial real estate on his books. I may have lost my train of thought on your question.
And then, so I guess we can transition. You started working at the mezzanine fund.
Yeah. So in about, it's probably 95. Well, no, even before that, a little before that. When I went to work for Bank One, it was to provide senior debt. Had a great boss. His name was Jack Neal. He ran all of the commercial bank. Very strong, but he didn't stay when they merged with JP. But he was sort of my mentor in a way. And as we reorganized real estate, he asked me what I wanted to do. And I'd been talking to some folks in California, the Disney company, Disney family, the Roy Disney family, about mezzanine debt. And I had learned quite a bit about it and approached them while I was at Bank One to form a merged entity to go out and provide mezzanine loans.
And that's just a, a joint venture between Bank One and the Disney family?
Correct.
It's crazy. It's awesome.
Yeah. We called it, what did we call it? I can't remember. But it was a fund. We had a book. Guy that ran the commercial bank for Bank One and then JP for a while. He and I went on the road. We flew all over the country, pitched this JV, pitched the Disney family.
How'd you get in contact with the Disney family?
Well, it's a long story, but the guy who set me up to go to California and work for Great Western, he was on Great Western's board, but he was also on the Disney board.
It's nice.
And he had actually helped organize the takeover of the Disney company while Roy stayed independent. Walt was running the Disney company, but he ran the takeover of the Disney company, and that's when everything changed for the Disney company. So our relationship was with the Roy Disney family and not the Disney company.
Okay. Interesting. And so we're kind of leading up to what I would call the greatest or the worst banking crisis we've had since the Great Depression in 2008. I guess we should start. You transitioned to, it was Zions Bank and then Zions Bancorporation. So I guess let's start there, starting with Zions Bank. You were over real estate in probably the least lucky time to be in real estate.
Yeah, it's the Great Recession, not the Great Depression.
Or, sorry, since the Great Depression,
Yeah.
yes.
And that was painful. And I was making mezz loans for Zions. We did quite a few with a focus on multifamily mostly.
Across the West or just?
Across the West. And mostly customers of Zions Bancorp. That's where I started at Zions. And then our CEO, Harris, asked me to take a position at Zions Bank, which is one of the 7 banks, and fix it because it was broken.
It's quite the task. So,
and Scott Anderson would probably not agree with my terminology that it was broken, but the commercial real estate book was really in bad shape.
It was I think Sam mentioned this before, but it was some percentage and you got it to 99% success or non-default. Is that?
Well, when you look at the metrics, you end up with loans that are classified and criticized. That's what you want to avoid. And the strongest loans aren't that. They're in another world. I was fortunate because I was given the responsibility at Zions Bank for the positive book and the tough book. And, oftentimes if the book's big enough, you'll divide that and you'll have somebody take the tough book and somebody take the positive book. But I was given both books, and And the regulators were, they weren't, people need to appreciate regulators when they look at commercial real estate or look at even commercial loans. They're just looking for loans that meet certain metrics. And if they don't, they'll put them on watch. They may downgrade them further. You may have to carry a reserve for a possible loss.
What metrics are you referring to on that?
Well, when it comes to income property, anything below a 1.0 debt coverage ratio would be considered criticized, maybe classified. And I'll give you the way that our metrics worked. 1 through 10 was a pass loan. That's what they call them, pass grade. And that'd be like a 120 coverage ratio. But when they start to sink, and it may be because interest expense increases, like it has, and your revenue doesn't, that would impact.
Not good.
Yeah. And you have regulators as your sounding board, basically, but sometimes even worse than that.
I want to know what those conversations look like, because I think people refer to them as kind of like breathing down their neck, but like, what are those conversations like?
Well, going back to the big banks that you were talking about and regional banks, big banks have, maybe 6 to 7% of their total assets are in commercial real estate. A bank like Zions, it's more like 25.
And what does the rest of the portfolio look like on that note?
C&I loans, business loans, and then retail, consumer loans. And all of that is all governed by underwriting metrics that are part of your basic underwriting provisions. But banks are different. Some banks might be a little aggressive and take on some loans that they think will be better in a year or 3 or whatever, and some banks aren't. So Zions Bank was 25% commercial real estate, probably 50% C&I and 25% consumer.
And of the 25, was it, do you have certain buckets that you put it in? Like, maybe 10% of the 25 is new construction, and then existing office, existing retail. What part of those struggled the most in 2008? And I guess why? I mean, obviously construction loans were difficult, but was there any kind of commonalities, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, a loan that's been there for a while is stabilized, covers debt service is one thing, and a loan that's a construction loan that is still trying to hit stabilization and can't because the market's soft. That's just a different category. And one of the things that I pushed was, I wanted to make sure we had one voice for both. And I was in conflict sometimes with some of the execs over that. And some execs wanted to hire their person to run the REO group, for example, or the tough loan, group. And, you'd have to get your data together and make your position and try and keep it all together, which I feel really good that I was able to do for the 10 years I was CCO.
And what do you think you did that maybe other groups didn't? Because one of the questions before the show was kind of talking about how Zions kind of, I don't know if they spared a lot of developers, but they didn't crush them like other, big banks were. What do you think you did that others didn't?
Well, what happens is some big banks will make non-recourse loans, and when you have a non-recourse loan, you're not really looking to the sponsor anymore. You're looking to the real estate. And sometimes big banks will say, well, we're going to get out of the real estate business, or we're going to lean out, and we're going to take our worst loans. We're going to package them and sell them, or we're going to be hardcore about how we respond. Whereas, if you have sponsors and recourse loans, and you have kind of an enterprise look at your sponsor, and they have other assets that are okay, but this one isn't, that can be an okay thing, and every bank's going to want to take the best assets. And, not every sponsor is going to give a bank the best assets. They're going to want to spread the love and spread it around. And so that's, the big banks now, today, even though they may have 6% CRE or 10 or whatever they sit at, they're now having to deal with the real numbers. A year ago, they could talk through, probably a good sob story for their sponsors, and if, so. But the more the better your sponsors and your customers, maybe the more forgiving you'll be, or more relaxed you'll be, because real estate's cyclical; it's going to come back. But you give the example of the initial 60% loan to value. So you assume that you have 40% market equity, and maybe the real value is 50. So you have a 10% margin there. You need to decide if you're going to live with your sponsor through that, and if they're going to pay you. And if they don't pay you, that's a monetary default. We have a lot of technical defaults. You'll see a lot of technical defaults in a portfolio.
And what are technical defaults?
A technical default might be, let's say you underwrite a transaction and it's a 120 coverage ratio. And let's say they go to 115 in reality. That might be a technical default, but it's not a monetary default. It's not something that you can foreclose on. And your sponsor will have a story, and they'll say, well, we think it's going to be 120 in a year or 6 months. And, you kind of have to assess emotionally their ability to do that and where they're really coming from. If it's still sinking, you think it's going to be a 110 next year, you'll put it on a watch list. It still might not be a monetary default, but you'll downgrade it. You'll put it on a special list. You'll have a different banker working on it, a workout banker. And a workout banker is really important. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think I was given some of the opportunities I was that I had been on the workout side. And a lot of bankers haven't. And that, now that we have this, we have an almost recession, but the economics have changed, and we have bankers that are more accustomed to tougher economics. But we don't have bankers, when you test the banker universe, let's say they're from 25 to 55 years old. The 55-year-olds may have been through some recessionary times, 2008. But they may not. They may have started banking when they were, 35, 40, or been promoted then and weren't really in the action. They're going to be a little less experienced. And so to have a hardcore workout banker at your behest is pretty important.
And what do those workout, how does that work? Let's say I've got I bought an office building for $100 million. You wrote a loan at 60, now it's worth 50. How do you work out that $10 million difference? Is it just because I'm sure the banks don't want all of these loans. If the sponsors can't operate them, I bet the banks don't want to operate them as well. So how do those workout programs actually work?
Well, if the sponsor isn't making payments, then that's probably a foreclosure. Sometimes there's a little bit of breathing room there, but you need bankers that understand foreclosure. You need bankers that know when to file. You need bankers that know when a sponsor is telling you a true story of how they're going to make up the deficit. But a value issue is one thing. A cash flow issue is a different thing.
So if you're no longer the CCO, but if you were, for let's say these big banks that have a very, very large office portfolio, what do you do? How do you even start? Do you look at the cash flow issue versus the value issue? Is it all subjective on each deal? What would you do?
Well, first of all, you need to have access to the data, and most bank data is private.
Mm-hmm.
And you need a banker who you need to sign confidentiality agreements.
Yeah.
So you need to get the actual data to know what's happening. Is it the sponsor? Is it the real estate? And then you need to think about, when does that asset class come back? Office, when you think about office and you look around, office buildings can be something else.
And if they land, they can be land.
They can be land. Them. They can. That's going to be less than a 50% loan to value.
Right.
But maybe they can be converted into something this year, next year, the year after. And some of them can be repurposed to industrial. I've seen office buildings that have been converted to hospitality. There's one down in Salt Lake that was. It was an office building that was
on South Temple. There's one right now.
Yeah, there was one on. There was a guy in the Northwest who went around and fixed. He'd take office buildings and he'd turn them into hotels.
The Red Lion is what you're.
No. This was. This is on, I think, 3rd South, and has a restaurant that's really nice. It was. I think it was a bank office, and so the office is really the first floor office was converted to a restaurant, and then they converted all the units above But I'll try and remember the name of it. It's still here. I think they operate. It's across the street from the Ballet West.
We'll find it and put it in the show notes after.
Yeah.
So, and I guess the question is, a lot of those office buildings, they just can't be converted. The floor plates are huge. Like I think of a lot of the stuff on like kind of over in West Valley where they used to be just big floor plates for call centers. Can't really convert that. A lot of those types of tenants aren't coming back. Is the bank just like, what are they thinking?
Well, a lot of them can't, but you can also subdivide and still run an office. And, maybe you can put some light manufacturing in the half of that space. Yeah. So some of it can be converted, some of it can't. And we'll have to see. I think we're now starting to see true devaluation in office buildings. And the great opportunities are starting to appear. I think the big banks have the most of what I would be looking at. I mean, we've seen material defaults in California, in our California market. but those were levered high. Those were CMBS deals, or 80 LTV deals. And banks kind of hang out in the 60, 65 range. But banks are trying to get construction loans to a place where they can be taken out, for the most part.
Yeah.
Banks don't like to make long-term mortgages,
Right.
in commercial.
Question on construction loans. This is a little random, but how come I've never seen a bank tie construction loans to treasuries? They're always based off, whether it's SOFR or Prime. You know why that is?
Well, SOFR's new.
Or formerly LIBOR.
Yeah.
Yeah. That shows you how new I am in the business.
That's good. It's good. We should forget LIBOR. If when you it almost doesn't matter what your index is. If you know what your basic rate is, it really doesn't matter what your index is. An index is, depending on the index, can change monthly. It can change quarterly. It can change annually. I saw today that the 10-year adjusted down.
Finally. It's been great.
Yeah, I mean, it's happening. The rate increase phenomena may be coming to an end.
Do you have any predictions on that, by the way?
Well, we've always said 2024 would be lighter. And I think the 10-year was, we talked about the 10-year getting down to 4 by the end of 24, maybe below 4. So we'll have to see. It got a little stiff. So I think next year's going to be a better year. And I think that will affect office. I think office owners are going to have to, gamble and say, is this the time to keep it? And then you have all the COVID rules, and you have companies, some that are, totally work at home, and you have some that are 3 days a week and some that are 5.
Yep.
And you kind of have to know what they are. But especially if you're going to buy distressed. But it's a different world now. That has added an element of complexity that I don't think anybody ever thought would be here. An office was doing okay before COVID.
Yeah. It was, New York City office was one of the greatest assets on earth, really. Speaking of complex, I want to talk to you about setting up a recourse vehicle. Someone like me who doesn't have a $50 million net worth, it's tough to scale into your recourse loan career. I want to talk about setting up a recourse vehicle, something you can point the recourse at. What would you want to see on that?
Well, it's a pretty complex world, really. I mean, so we'll have sponsors that will borrow full recourse, all the time, and that's just a function of not their net worth, but their net worth and the liquidity of their net worth, which I think a lot of people gloss over. You can say that you have a 60% LTV and 40% equity, but that equity might not be capital. And capital really matters. You need to be able to move money around. And so I never really focused on net worth. And real estate operators have the most bogus net worths of anybody in the total industry.
This is news to me.
That's true.
I think my entire portfolio is still worth a 4 cap, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, 4 cap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that, if I set up my own entity, is it just a bunch of liquidity that I guess a friend and I were talking about this the other day, like how could we set up, an entity to protect against, the absolute worst case scenario of foreclosure and personal guarantees and that type of stuff. So I guess, do you just want to see a bunch of liquidity in this one entity, whether it's stocks, bonds, whatever it is, cash?
Yeah. And then, you need a covenant to keep that.
Okay. So it'd be, you got to keep it at a valuation of $10 million or something.
Yeah. And cash and marketable securities is, what most people would want to see.
Okay.
And sometimes it's less than that. I mean, sometimes it might be 5. On a smaller project, it might be 3. But to have capital and to provide recourse to that capital is the important thing. And, if you underwrite a small transaction and you say, okay, you run a stress test and you say the worst case here is that this thing could be devalued and they'd have to write a check for $1 million, then maybe you ask them for $1.5 million in liquidity.
Okay.
Liquidity covenant.
How do you look like on the stress test? How wide do those margins get as far as, increasing, decreasing NOI, increasing taxes, insurance, all of that stuff? What do you guys look for?
Well, it depends a lot on what your analytics support and who's running it. Is it on the treasury side? Is it on the banker side? Who's really calling the shots of your stress testing? And do you stress test individual assets? Do you stress test portfolios? What are your assumptions? Do you stress vacancy? Do you stress rents? And we're sort of coming into a period now where everybody runs stress tests, but I don't see loans turned down because you run a stress test and maybe the coverage ratio is a 1.0.
Yeah.
It's good to know. It's good to know where the sensitivities are in a loan as a banker, and to put that in front, put that in your credit presentations to talk about it. But at the end of the day, it matters what things, really are. And if you're at a 130 real coverage ratio and you stress it, you're at a 1.0, that's decent information. What were your stress points? But you're still going to make the loan.
Right.
There are a lot of things you can stress. We stress most variables, and that's and that's really at the banker level. We have I still work there. Individuals that run stress tests that don't take it at the loan level. They take it at the portfolio level, and they throw some pretty big metrics at it. And that somehow addresses maybe what your loss reserve should be. But that loss reserve, for example, this is a good example. Zions Bancorp's loss bucket is, probably around $700 million, sitting there waiting for losses.
That's very reassuring to hear, honestly.
Yeah, well, and some banks are capitalized that way, and reserves don't, they're not counted as capital. So they're there for potential losses. And if you have extreme loss scenarios, you might have an extreme budget for loss. If you're a little thin and you don't think the worst thing is going to happen, even though you still run a stress test, your loss ratio might be lower. And all the banks have different loss ratios. I think ours runs at about 110% of our balances. And, you know, in 08, the worst quarter was probably a 250, 280 basis point loss rate. That was for a quarter. That wasn't for a year. It wasn't for the time period that stress tests run today, which is, you know, they look at 10 quarters today. How much are you going to lose in 10 quarters? So, you know, I'm really proud of Zions for managing the reserve the way they have. I've always felt it was a little heavy. But, you know, you're talking to your regulators when you're talking your reserve. And, you know, regulators don't want to see you know, under reserve. They just don't.
Makes sense. Want to bring it home with kind of what you're up to today, and then also kind of how you feel about the economy moving forward. So I guess let's start with that. And I mean, that was kind of reassuring to hear about all of the reserves set on the sidelines, but are you worried about regional banks as kind of a whole outside of Zions? And I guess, what do you think about, you know, moving forward?
Well, I think in March, you know, we saw some pretty big corrections and saw some failures, and you know, those were legit. I'm not really worried about regional banks. I think they're probably well reserved. You know, if there's a big hiccup, if rates took off again, and or you know, you had an industry that a lot of people were concentrated on. Concentration risk is a big deal. So some banks have, you know, an entire credit card portfolio. They aren't diverse. And an entire credit card portfolio is probably what they're trying to get out of, and probably trying to get more into commercial loans. But you know, those would be regional banks that I'd be maybe a little nervous about, ones that are concentrated and, you know, have a modest reserve, maybe not a big reserve. The too big to fail banks, you know, like I said, if you're at 6% in any category, you know, one of a CEO or CFO's primary missions is to diversify such that you have great exposure in any industry, but you don't have concentration risk. And when you look at the banks that failed in March, they had concentration. Either had a big residential portfolio, or you had a big tech portfolio would be one. And tech loans are a whole different world. You know, they're pretty hard to say this tech loan has a coverage ratio, because they have sponsors that are feeding it, and it probably doesn't have a positive coverage
There's no
ratio.
coverage anywhere. So,
yeah.
Okay. And now, so what are you up to today? I know you're involved in affordable housing and sit on different boards. Just talk about what you're up to today.
Well, I'm trying to get my act together. I was pretty deep into our business and the bank. Affordable housing is very important. There's a huge gap between rental and for sale. And those are the two realms to look at housing in. You know, for sale is out of reach for a lot of folks in the Wasatch Front. Rental is tough as well. And, you know, values and prices come back when it's out of reach. So I would expect a little retrenching to occur. And the affordable space is in between all that.
Yeah.
And a lot of affordables determined based on adjusted gross income and that ratio, 80%, 60%. If you look at where we are, Salt Lake's done a good job. I'm sure the other surrounding counties have. We have a good credit rating, really good. It's been great for years. But more and more people, when you have rates go up like they have, and they went up very quick, and you don't have a lot of supply of multifamily property, you're going to see, both of those values go up, and individuals are going to be hard pressed to rent, $3,000 a month.
It's expensive.
To own maybe is $4,500 to $6,000 a month.
Yeah.
And everybody that got great rates and got them a year ago plus are happy and hanging on. And anybody that didn't, they're going to have to pay a higher rate or pay cash for their assets.
Tough.
Paying cash is tough.
So what do you think the solution is then? How can we even move the needle a little bit?
Well, it's kind of the rich get richer discussion, and that's happening. As rates go up, that happens. I read the other day that 30% of Americans own their home free and clear. That blew me away.
Yeah.
I thought that there were many more borrowers in that space.
Me too.
Yeah. And that was a journal article. I tend to believe what I read in the journal.
Yeah.
But that number is increasing, not decreasing. So 30, then 35. They talked about it 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and it was 20-something%. So it's just...
Even that sounds high.
Yeah. So this affordable space, we need to address that. And maybe incomes need to, continue to rise. I don't think they will. I think, that one of the reasons they talked about a lower rate today was that, inflation's getting under control. So I don't know where it ends. But I know that people just need to be prepared. And, we used to look at the ratio of somebody's ability to cover a mortgage. And 40% of gross income was usually the number.
Mm-hmm.
And anything north of that would be a stretch. Somebody that, had a mortgage payment that was 50% of their gross was going to struggle. You're going to have a harder time. And so those kind of metrics and those kind of ratios we need to continue to watch and look at. But it's going to be a challenging time.
I agree. Well, I've learned a lot from this, so I appreciate you coming on. Hope to have you back soon.
Thanks. You're welcome.